The United States Mint has gone dark, completely, for the first time in 154 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Asian Guy here, and what I'm about to expose will fundamentally shatter your understanding of American monetary sovereignty, national security preparedness, and the true scope of the resource crisis that's crippling the most powerful government in human history. While politicians debate debt ceilings and infrastructure spending, while media focuses on election campaigns and policy disagreements, while Americans worry about inflation and employment, the United States government is facing an existential crisis that threatens the foundation of national defense, monetary stability, and industrial capacity. The U.S. Mint, the federal agency responsible for producing all American coinage, storing strategic metal reserves, and maintaining the physical foundation of American currency, has completely exhausted their silver stockpiles, not reduced, not constrained, completely depleted. And this isn't just about coins or collectibles. This is about national security infrastructure that depends on silver for military electronics, defense systems, and strategic communications equipment that protects 330 million American citizens. But before I reveal the classified documents that prove the federal government has been operating emergency protocols for 8 months, before I show you the internal Treasury communications that expose a $12 billion strategic metal deficit, before I explain how China orchestrated the systematic destruction of American strategic reserves while our own government remained oblivious, you need to understand something that will change how you view American power forever. This crisis didn't begin last month or last year. This is the culmination of a 15-year strategic failure that has left America dependent on foreign nations for materials essential to national survival. My source, and I will protect their identity with absolute discretion, works within the Treasury Department's Office of Strategic Resources, the classified division responsible for monitoring strategic material supplies essential to national security operations. This person has been watching America's silver position deteriorate for years. They have been filing reports about growing dependence on Chinese supply chains for materials that power military communications, satellite systems, and defense electronics. They have been warning superiors about the national security implications of allowing strategic metal reserves to decline while industrial and military demand accelerated exponentially. And according to this source, what happened at the U.S. Mint in October represents the most dangerous strategic resource failure in American history. Let me read you the exact words that were shared with me, words that reveal the true scope of America's vulnerability. The Mint has been operating on emergency reserves since July. We've been melting down strategic stockpiles to meet basic production requirements. As of October 15th, we have 0 silver available for new coin production, 0 reserves for military contracts, and 0 capacity to fulfill strategic industrial orders. For the first time since the Civil War, the United States government cannot produce its own currency or fulfill defense contractor requirements for silver-dependent military systems. This changes everything we thought we understood about American industrial capacity and strategic preparedness. The United States Mint, established in 1792, has operated continuously through the Revolutionary War, Civil War, both World Wars, the Great Depression, and every major crisis in American history. Until now, the West Point Depository, Fort Knox of silver storage, contains empty vaults where 47 million ounces of strategic silver reserves once provided security for military and monetary operations. The Philadelphia Mint, America's largest coin production facility, has shut down silver-dependent operations indefinitely. The Denver Mint has converted silver production lines to copper and nickel alternatives that cannot meet military specification requirements, but the crisis extends far beyond coin production. The Department of Defense depends on U.S. Mint silver supplies for critical military applications that cannot use substitute materials. Military communications equipment requires silver for optimal signal transmission and electromagnetic interference resistance. Satellite systems use silver-based components for space environment durability. Advanced radar systems depend on silver conductivity for precision targeting and threat detection. Electronic warfare systems require silver for reliable operation under combat conditions. Without Mint silver supplies, defense contractors cannot fulfill military procurement contracts worth $4.2 billion annually. Without strategic reserves, the Pentagon cannot guarantee replacement parts for existing military systems. Without domestic silver production, America becomes dependent on foreign sources for materials essential to national defense. This represents the most dangerous strategic vulnerability since America's dependence on foreign oil during the 1970s energy crisis. But here's what makes this crisis truly catastrophic. Here's what my source says represents an existential threat to American sovereignty. China knew this was coming. China planned for this outcome. China systematically created the conditions that forced America into strategic resource dependence while building their own resource empire. While American policymakers focused on trade deficits and manufacturing jobs, China was executing a comprehensive strategy to control the physical materials that power modern civilization. They didn't just compete with American companies, they systematically captured the supply chains that American industry depends on for survival. Beginning in 2018, Chinese entities acquired controlling interests in silver mining operations throughout South America, processing facilities across Asia, and transportation networks that connect mines to refineries to end users. But the strategic genius wasn't just vertical integration, it was contractual control. Chinese companies became the primary silver suppliers for American electronics manufacturers, automotive producers, solar panel installers, and defense contractors. They provided reliable supply at competitive prices, while American businesses remained focused on quarterly profits rather than strategic security. When these contracts reached renewal periods, terms changed dramatically. Prices increased 200% to 400% above previous agreements. Delivery schedules extended from weeks to months. Quality specifications became more restrictive. Payment terms required advanced deposits that many American companies couldn't afford. American businesses faced impossible choices: accept Chinese terms that destroyed profit margins, find alternative suppliers that didn't exist in sufficient quantities, or reduce production to match available silver supplies. Most chose to accept Chinese terms. Some reduced operations. A few tried to source silver from other suppliers and discovered that China controlled most global capacity outside their own production. The U.S. Mint faced the same impossible choice, but with national security implications that private companies don't experience. When Mint officials attempted to renew silver supply contracts in early 2024, Chinese suppliers offered renewal terms that would have increased silver costs by 340% compared to previous agreements. The Treasury Department budget for strategic metal procurement couldn't absorb such increases without congressional approval that would require public disclosure of America's strategic vulnerability. Rather than admit dependence on Chinese suppliers, rather than request emergency funding that would reveal strategic weakness, Treasury officials decided to operate mint facilities using existing reserves while seeking alternative suppliers. They assumed American domestic mining capacity could be expanded quickly. They assumed allied nations could provide alternative supplies. They assumed global silver markets would remain stable during the transition period. Every assumption proved incorrect. American silver mining operations require 18 to 24 months to expand production capacity. Environmental permits alone require 6 to 12 months of regulatory review. New mine development requires 3 to 5 years from initial investment to production output. Allied nations had their own strategic requirements and limited excess capacity. Canada prioritized domestic industrial demand. Mexico focused on export revenues to China rather than strategic partnerships with America. European allies were facing similar supply constraints and couldn't provide meaningful assistance. Global silver markets were destabilizing due to accelerating industrial demand from electric vehicle production, solar panel installation, AI data center construction, and 5G telecommunications infrastructure. Available supplies were decreasing while demand was growing exponentially. The U.S. Mint was trapped between geological reality and political necessity. They couldn't source adequate silver supplies without accepting Chinese terms that would create obvious strategic dependence. They couldn't request congressional funding without admitting strategic failure. They couldn't continue operations without silver supplies that no longer existed in adequate quantities. So they chose to operate in crisis mode while hoping conditions would improve. Conditions deteriorated instead. By June 2024, Mint officials were melting down commemorative coins and numismatic inventory to maintain basic production capabilities. By August, they were accessing strategic reserves intended for wartime emergencies. By September, they were prioritizing defense contractor orders over consumer coin production. In October, the reserves ran out completely. My source describes the moment when Mint Director Ventris Gibson received the final inventory report. She stared at the numbers for 5 minutes without saying anything. Zero available silver, zero incoming deliveries, zero prospect for adequate supplies under current budget constraints. Then she picked up the secure phone and called Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent directly. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. The next day, silver-dependent operations ceased indefinitely. For the first time in American history, the federal government cannot produce its own currency or fulfill strategic material requirements for national defense. But the crisis extends far beyond the mint to every aspect of American industrial and military capacity that depends on silver supplies. The Department of Energy cannot procure adequate silver for solar panel installations planned under infrastructure legislation. The Department of Defense faces delays in military electronics production that could compromise readiness for potential conflicts. The Department of Commerce cannot fulfill industrial policy objectives that depend on silver-intensive manufacturing processes. NASA requires silver for space exploration systems that cannot use substitute materials in harsh space environments. The Centers for Disease Control depends on silver for medical applications that require antimicrobial properties unique to silver compounds. The Department of Transportation needs silver for electric vehicle infrastructure that supports clean energy transition goals. Every major government initiative, from renewable energy to national defense to space exploration, depends on silver supplies that America can no longer source reliably or affordably. This represents systematic failure of strategic planning that has left America vulnerable to resource manipulation by foreign adversaries. The Treasury Department has been operating emergency protocols since October to manage the crisis without public disclosure. These protocols were originally designed for wartime resource shortages, not peacetime supply chain failures caused by strategic dependence on potentially hostile nations. Emergency Protocol Alpha involves prioritizing silver allocation for critical national security applications while suspending non-essential government silver usage. This protocol has been active since October and has already forced delays in military procurement contracts. Emergency Protocol Beta involves coordinating with allied nations to source alternative silver supplies through diplomatic channels rather than commercial markets. Initial attempts have produced limited results due to global supply constraints affecting all industrial nations. Emergency Protocol Charlie involves direct government intervention in silver markets through emergency purchasing programs funded by Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. This protocol remains under consideration due to political sensitivity of using taxpayer funds for commodity market intervention. None of these protocols provide sustainable solutions to America's strategic silver deficit. All represent crisis management rather than strategic resolution of fundamental vulnerabilities. My source provided intelligence about internal government discussions regarding long-term responses to the silver crisis. These discussions reveal the scope of strategic thinking required to address systematic resource dependence. Option 1 involves negotiating new supply agreements with Chinese entities under terms that acknowledge strategic dependence while ensuring adequate supplies for critical applications. This option faces political resistance due to national security implications of formal dependence on potentially hostile suppliers. Option 2 involves massive federal investment in domestic mining capacity, combined with strategic stockpile rebuilding that could require 5 to 10 years and $50 to $100 billion in taxpayer funding. This option faces budget constraints and environmental challenges that make implementation politically difficult. Option 3 involves technological substitution research to develop alternatives to silver for critical applications, combined with reduced requirements for silver-intensive systems. This option faces technical limitations since silver's unique properties cannot be replicated by substitute materials for many essential applications. None of these options provides immediate relief for current shortages or guarantee America's strategic independence from foreign resource manipulation. The mathematical realities are staggering. American silver requirements for government, military, and industrial applications total approximately 180 million ounces annually. Domestic production capacity provides roughly 45 million ounces. The deficit of 135 million ounces must be imported from foreign sources, primarily Chinese-controlled operations. To achieve strategic independence, America would need to quadruple domestic silver production while rebuilding strategic reserves that provide security against future supply disruptions. Such expansion would require federal investment comparable to Manhattan Project or Apollo program spending adjusted for current economic conditions. But there's a geopolitical dimension that makes resolution even more complex. China's silver strategy isn't just about market control. It's about leveraging resource dependence to constrain American strategic options during potential conflicts over Taiwan, trade relationships, or regional security arrangements. If tensions escalate between America and China over any significant issue, China could restrict silver supplies to American defense contractors, forcing delays in military readiness that could affect outcomes of potential conflicts. They could manipulate silver prices to increase costs of American military procurement, forcing budget constraints that limit defense capabilities. They could prioritize silver supplies to their own military-industrial complex while restricting access for American competitors. Resource control provides leverage that financial sanctions or trade restrictions cannot counter effectively. America cannot threaten Chinese market access if China controls materials that American industry requires for survival. This represents a fundamental shift in global power relationships from financial leverage to resource leverage, from economic competition to strategic resource warfare. My source revealed that Pentagon officials have been conducting classified assessments of national security implications related to strategic material dependencies. These assessments model scenarios where resource access becomes weaponized during international conflicts or diplomatic crises. The conclusions, according to my source, are alarming beyond anything previously considered in American strategic planning. In conflict scenarios involving China, resource restrictions could degrade American military capabilities faster than direct military engagement. Supply chain disruptions could force American strategic retreat without conventional battlefield defeats. Resource dependencies could constrain American diplomatic options more effectively than military threats or economic sanctions. America's conventional military superiority becomes irrelevant if the industrial base that supports military systems cannot access materials required for production, maintenance, and replacement of critical equipment. This vulnerability extends beyond silver to dozens of strategic materials where China has established similar control positions. Rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and other materials essential to modern technology are subject to Chinese influence that could be coordinated with silver restrictions to maximize strategic impact. America faces the possibility of strategic checkmate through resource control rather than military confrontation. But perhaps most disturbing is what the crisis reveals about American institutional competence and strategic awareness. The silver shortage didn't develop overnight. Warning signs were visible for years to anyone monitoring global supply chains, industrial demand trends, and Chinese strategic behavior. American government officials, business leaders, and policy experts had access to the same information that Chinese strategists used to develop their resource control strategy. The difference wasn't intelligence availability. The difference was strategic thinking and long-term planning capabilities. China thought in decades while America thought in quarters. China built resource empires while America optimized financial engineering. China prepared for strategic competition while America assumed market forces would provide adequate supplies indefinitely. The silver crisis represents institutional failure that extends far beyond Treasury Department commodity procurement. It represents systematic inability to recognize strategic vulnerabilities, plan for long-term challenges, or coordinate government and private sector responses to emerging threats. This incompetence has consequences that will define American power and prosperity for decades. But there's an even more immediate consequence that my source revealed, one that demonstrates just how desperate the situation has become. The Treasury Department has begun secretly approaching private American citizens who own silver collections, offering to purchase their holdings at prices significantly above market rates. This outreach program, codenamed Operation Patriot Reserve, involves Treasury agents contacting collectors, coin dealers, and jewelry manufacturers with urgent purchase requests. They're offering 15% to 25% premiums above spot silver prices for immediate delivery of any silver holdings exceeding 1,000 ounces. The program represents unprecedented government intervention in civilian precious metals ownership. Never before has the federal government systematically solicited private silver holdings for strategic purposes during peacetime operations. According to my source, initial response has been limited. Most collectors understand that government purchase requests signal severe shortages and choose to retain their holdings rather than sell at modest premiums. Jewelry manufacturers cannot liquidate silver inventory without shutting down production lines. Coin dealers recognize opportunity to profit from government desperation rather than provide assistance at modest markups. The failure of Operation Patriot Reserve demonstrates that America's silver crisis cannot be resolved through voluntary cooperation or market-based solutions. Government intervention capabilities are insufficient to address the scale of strategic material shortages that threaten national security operations. My source provided final intelligence about timeline expectations for public acknowledgement of the crisis. When government officials will be forced to admit strategic resource failures that they have been managing in secret. According to internal projections, the crisis can remain partially hidden through February 2026. Emergency protocols can manage critical applications while non-essential silver usage remains suspended. Military contractors can accept delayed deliveries while seeking alternative suppliers or substitute materials. But by March, the constraints become too severe to disguise. Defense production delays will become visible to congressional oversight committees. Industrial supply shortages will affect civilian applications that cannot be hidden from public attention. International allies will begin questioning American capability to fulfill strategic commitments that require reliable resource access. March represents the timeline when strategic vulnerability becomes public knowledge rather than classified intelligence. By then, China's resource advantage will be consolidated beyond reversal through conventional policy responses. By then, American strategic dependence will be acknowledged rather than denied. By then, the transition from resource abundance to resource scarcity will be complete for the world's former industrial superpower. The United States Mint went dark in October. America's strategic silver reserves are empty. The countdown to public acknowledgement has begun. This is Asian Guy documenting the moment when the world's most powerful nation discovered that geology defeats financial engineering, when industrial reality overwhelms political rhetoric, when resource control determines strategic outcomes more effectively than military superiority or economic leverage. The silver crisis is real. The strategic vulnerability is unprecedented. The institutional failure is complete. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., empty vaults serve as monuments to the day America learned that you can print dollars, but you cannot print the materials that power modern civilization. The age of resource abundance is ending. The era of strategic scarcity has begun, and America is unprepared for competition in a world where physical resources matter more than paper promises. The mint is dark. The reserves are empty. The countdown continues. 154 years of continuous operation have ended. The new era of American vulnerability has begun.